This story about Warrior Matt Cole and this heroic strike that almost went on for 2 years has been something that I've gained a lot of inspiration from. From the way that people were handling themselves, to solidarity, the importance of the moment, the just nature of this fight. I mean, this one was one that was as clear as day, who the villains were and who the heroes
Mhm.
were. And as you were just saying, like, this was one of the things that right when we launched Left Reckoning, the strike began. It was the kind of story that we wanted to be covering on Left Reckoning, because we had a feeling that I think has been borne out to be true, that unfortunately, there can be a lack of attention on the left sometimes to what's happening in certain parts of the country. And there's very important labor fights and opportunities to build a strong working class movement all across this country. And this Warrior Matt Cole strike, I think, really embodied that. And I'll give people a quick recap in a second, but just not to bury the lead. That strike is over, and we're still going to be seeing what happens over the next couple of weeks. But it did not end in a victory. The striking workers are going back to work. Some of them. Some
Mhm.
people have been put on a do not rehire list. Some people have found jobs that have better pay than what Warrior Met is trying to force on these workers. But it was a moment where working people tried to band together, and they came up against an incredibly powerful force, which is American capital, um, without too many allies. Like, I don't want to underplay the amount of solidarity and support out there. One from like left independent media, two from the labor movement, two from a lot of people on the left. But as we'll get to later, like the political response from people in power was lacking, to put it lightly. So they went up and they fought and they lost. And I think it's a tough story for a lot of reasons. One, because of what this means to all those people who went up and they tried to assert themselves, and they did. And they stood on their own 2 feet and did something really inspiring. I mean, to last like a strike for a month is exceptional. To last a strike for
Mhm.
6 months is something else. To do it a year is amazing. Coming up on 2 years, I mean, it's heroic, and it's I believe one of the longest strikes in Alabama labor history. And they're going up against a coalition of finance capital that are some of the most well connected, deep pocketed, and vicious and brutal examples of capital and capitalism that we have today. And I mean, like, we're going to cover this again in the next 2 weeks, because this is relatively new. The questions on whether or not it's right for them to accept, whether or not rank and file agrees with the decision from the UMWA to end the strike and bring people back to work. Those are things that I think that I'm going to take the lead on from the people who were on the ground doing that fight before I opine from the outside.
Mhm.
So we'll revisit once we have a better sense of that in the next couple of weeks. But it is one of these things that, like, if you want to do this kind of thing, if you want to fight for the power of working people, we want to win, but we also have to know that sometimes, unfortunately, like, you will lose. I mean, you're going up against incredibly powerful forces, and this is just a moment to just say, like, you can't be rosy eyed, you can't sugarcoat things. Going up and having these fights is hard, right? Which is why I get sort of annoyed sometimes when people are like very they just talk about these things as if like they're just pure questions of will, right? There's material conditions, there's tactics, there's capacity to be able to do these kind of things. And this was a moment where basically, the people in control of Warrior Met had the ability to wait this out, and they did, and they didn't get any pressure from the government. And maybe there's some strategies here or there that might have been mistaken in it, in the strike. Maybe it could have been more militant, etc. We'll get into that in a minute. But at the end of the day, what happened there was truly heroic. It should be an inspiration to people all across the country and in the labor movement. But yeah, it's dark. It's sad. It's a loss, right? And if you know anything about sports or politics, sometimes you lose. And the point is to learn, to not turn your backs on each other, to not disperse, to not break down. But let's try to do some analysis and break these things.
Yeah. I mean, just it's a little bit to highlight the like uncertainty that workers are thrown into, like from looking like less than 2 weeks before back to work. unclear, which scabs are going to stay. For instance, there's going to
Hmm.
be drug testing for those returning, like you mentioned, the 40 that aren't allowed to return. And then also, like, it's going to be mandatory safety training to make sure they can adjust to the post scab conditions
Yeah.
in the plant. Yeah, I mean,
No, and like, and remember that like the this is dangerous work, and the
yeah.
conditions in the mines have certainly worsened, with less skilled workers who have been brought in from all across the country, from Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, etc. A lot of these people are going there chasing bonuses. A lot of these people don't have the same skills or knowledge as the people who have been on strike. So undoubtedly, like, they're returning to a workplace that's probably going to be less efficient, more dangerous, and in a bad state.
And like, I don't know if you wanted to get into history, but I did find it. I think it was at the Nolan or the Kim Kelly piece, but that actually, like, what helped the execs here was the high price of
Yeah.
commodities. So like in sort of bad times, promises, we'll take care of you later,
Hmm.
promises not kept, and then the prices of stuff rises at an inopportune moment, and it's like, it's just very damned if you do, damned if you don't think. Because if my memory serves, the Blair Mountain situation was the opposite, where the price was falling out of it, and that in
Hmm.
turn, like, so it's like, you see why these battles are hard to win when the executives can win on both sides.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is one of those things, where sometimes, like, literal conditions in the market make this difficult. All right, so let's zoom out really quick. Here's like the Spark Notes recap for people who have not seen our coverage over the past 2 years, aren't familiar with Kim Kelly's work on this, aren't familiar with the great stuff they've been doing at the Real News, aren't familiar with the great stuff they've been doing at the Battle Labor Report on this. So go back pre-pandemic, Warrior Met Coal is in a dire situation. The company is really struggling. So the union workers decide that in order to they make a collective sacrifice. They make an agreement that while this mine is suffering economically, we will accept a lower pay agreement, um, that will work for less than we think we deserve, to make sure that the finances don't cripple the mine and prevent us from being able to have a job in the first place, right? Which again, like, shows like how willing to work, with management, these workers have been. But the understanding was always that once this contract came up for renegotiation, that they would see a pay raise, and not just return, but ideally exceed the previous terms and conditions, for the work. Well, during this period of time, Warrior Met has a leadership change, and the coal company, which, by the way, just, for people, I think you should be defending people in any kind of industry like this, but remember that this is coal that is used to make steel, right? It's not coal that you use to make, to use in a power plant. But again, I don't think that, in my opinion, I'd be supporting people who do that work too. But
Yeah,
just to be
of
explicit,
course. Yeah.
um, so there's this understanding that there's going to be a pay raise once certain conditions are met. Well, BlackRock and a bunch of other financial corporations from New York, right, come in and they take over the company, and the company starts making more money than ever. Becomes incredibly profitable. They make their money, and then some. And then the workers say, "Okay, well, we made this deal. It's time to make good on it." And basically, the company refuses, to negotiate with them. And in fact, it was the lack of willingness on the company side to negotiate in good faith with the union that pushed the strike in the first place, right? So, this big capital, right, big New York City capital, basically takes control of this company. The company makes more money than ever. It's fine. The sacrifice that these workers made worked. It kept the company alive. It should be a time when everybody is able to benefit, in the increased amount of money that the company is making. But as we know, that's not what ends up happening. The people who make a bunch of fucking money doing nothing but coming into that situation with money in the first place, basically demand more and more and more. And in this period of time, the workers go on strike. Brutal campaign to break it down. You have, basically, the police acting like hawks. Anytime a worker might have accidentally stepped on company grounds, they're getting harassed by the police. You had scabs showing up and driving their vehicles through picket lines. Um, right? Just like a truly like asymmetrical battle in the sense of like you
and
have,
and the responders to which are like among the 40 people excluded from ability to return to work.
yeah. Yes, and and we'll get into we'll get into this Kim Kelly piece in a second that sort of breaks down more of these dynamics in a second. But I can't talk about the strike because it's meant a lot to me to try to support it in our own way, to try to cover it. Not only were these kind of actions of trying to show up and express power, to try to build community support, have a picket line, all that kind of stuff, but internally within the union, just an incredible story of people looking out for each other, because this means that people are going without wages. This means that Christmas time comes around and like the question is like, well, how are we going to buy toys for our children? People really looked out for each other, and it was a really beautiful example of the solidarity and the power that is possible when working class people stand together. You had this kind of solidarity, helping people out in difficult times, having a food pantry, Christmas toy drives, etc. Like a really, really beautiful example of what can happen when communities come together. But let's go to this Kim Kelly piece to sort of look at what happened and break this down. And if you haven't been following Kim Kelly's work, one, you really need to. And two, Kim Kelly's work on this strike in particular has been exceptional. And I really appreciate all of the work and the coverage on this strike. This was in The Nation yesterday. Why the Warrior Met strike is ending. After 23 months, the union tells more than 1,000 coal miners in Alabama it's time to head back to work without the contract they want. It may have cost the company over $1 billion in potential profits, but the high coal prices and the replacement workers that the company brought in meant that the strike hadn't made a sufficient dent in the company's bottom line. In 2022, Warrior Met Coal pulled in more than $640 million in net income. And a lot of this had to do with their ability to stockpile coal beforehand. So they had a lot of coal stockpiled, and as the price increased, they just were able to sell the already mined coal that gave them more time. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2019, the company did not shut down. Instead, while demand was low, it kept its miners working and stockpiled more than 2.8 million tons of coal. Thanks to that surplus, which Warrior Met sold off early in the strike, and the scabs who are paid supersized wages and monthly bonuses and have worked nonstop to keep the mines running, the company hit its production quotas and fulfilled its orders. The miners themselves were in a difficult position. They and their families were suffering while company bosses were not. So what went wrong? As the strike dragged on and coal prices remained high, the union struggled to keep morale high and the membership active. A core group of dedicated strikers and supporters did their best to build momentum, but attendance at rallies, events, and even on their picket line dwindled as many miners lapsed into apathy or found other work, right? Which is what happens when you're on strike for 2 years. The seemingly never-ending series of injunctions and restraining orders that Warrior Met convinced the local judiciary to issue didn't help matters, especially after workers lost the right to picket. With law, and we covered that extensively on Left Reckoning. If you want, you can go back and look at these stories. With law enforcement watching carefully, the union did its best to avoid taking risks that could land members in jail. This cautious posture frustrated some miners who wanted to take more militant action, while others believed it helped embolden the company. Quote, it felt like we were blamed for the strike lasting this long because we didn't do enough to keep the scabs out of the mine, Braxton Wright said. It was hard to hear that it was kind of our fault that we let the scabs cross the picket line and didn't shut down the production like we should have. But every time we did try to plan something, every time we had numbers, nothing happened. Wright also said that he and the miners felt that they and their union have been abandoned, left to fend for themselves against a hostile company in a right-to-work state run by anti-labor government officials and business-friendly local media. Alabama's a hard state to organize, he said. So many people from our local government to the local news to the National Labor Relations Board to the supposedly most pro-union president and labor secretary that we've ever had did not even mention us, We were just abandoned by everybody except for a few different groups that supported us and maybe a few politicians. Bernie Sanders from Vermont can support us, but the people that live here, they can't even be bothered to speak out or mention it, or mention it.
Yeah, I mean that NLRB point, that was like a early sort of feather in Joe's cap. Look at this great NLRB, and then they come down with the decision saying you're liable for any damage caused on strike, including like things like industrial processes that them going on strike paused, which is
Hmm.
absolutely absurd. And like all
Hmm.
these sorts of like the way like judges come in, and it's like it's a secret way that these things are neutered. Like this goes back to we talk about the St. Louis Commune in the 1870s. They're like, all right, guys, no more parades. You can't do
Yeah.
the parades, and like that was like the end of the commune. And the exact same thing is like, oh, you can picket, but with like one guy on this corner way out here, and that's just for your
Free speech
safety.
zones, right?
Yes,
No, I mean
exactly.
it just shows that the fact is that we have an asymmetrical system. Like we talk about living in a free country, but if you look at the way that labor law is enforced and practiced in this country, the advantages are so strongly in the corner of companies and corporations. You know, luckily you do have people like Bernie and folks like that who are trying to push back. But again, you have the most pro-union president. We'll get to him, boy. We'll get to him later. You know, just like getting applause lines for saying these kinds of things. And then one of the most important and historic strikes that we've seen in a country that has seen declining labor membership, right? Like people always say, like, well, why did labor membership, decline, right? Was it are working people confused or stupid or like working against their interests? Look at what happens here, right? This is a political problem. Um, that the state basically allows the game to be rigged against organized labor, against working people, and yeah, people are going to get demoralized. That's the fucking point of what they're doing. And we'll get more into that in a second. Before we jump into that, I do want to make sure that we're letting people speak in their own words. So this is Braxton Wright, who was interview who was quoted in the Kim Kelly piece. This is their conversation with none other than Bernie Sanders on the strike, and I believe this is from 2022, right?
It's hard to believe in a country we live in. You have to work two jobs just to make ends meet. Workers deserve better. We're helping build this country while we're making CEOs richer. We've been on strike since April 1st at Warrior Met coal mines here in Brookwood, Alabama. It started back in 2016 when the Jim Walter Resources went bankrupt. The judge ordered us to take concessions, which was about $6 an hour on average. We lost 100% insurance to an 80/20 plan with a $750 copay per person. As this contract ended, they actually wanted us to take even more concessions. The new CEO, when he took over, that's when we seen a major decline in just the way they treated their employees. They made a bunch of bad business decisions that cost the workers while they still made their millions. We're not even asking for more than what we're had. We're just asking to get back what we give up so the company can be profitable again. They say they can afford it, but we don't deserve it.
Did they really say that?
They really said that they will starve us out before they give us what we want, that we do not deserve it.
So they acknowledge that they have the money
They
to do away with
acknowledge they have the money. We set out to make it a career instead of a job. I mean, America's just, it seems like it's shifted from careers to jobs.
I want you all to understand that you are respected immensely all over this country, not only for your courage, but if they get away with slashing your health care,
Yep.
you got strong unions, you're in great unions. What do you think they're going to do to the guy who doesn't have a union?
Yes.
Right? If they are able to cut wages and not keep up with inflation, what do you think they're going to do to people who don't have a union?
It's time for the worker to stand back up. It's past time.
Yeah, I mean, uh, that last point that Bernie made, I think is so critical, and I think why Bernie inspired so much support and meant so much to so many of us was this understanding that like this is all of our fight. You know what I mean? Like this fight means a hell of a lot to those workers and to their families and to that community. But it also means a lot for workers across the state of Alabama. It means a lot for workers across the South, and it means a lot for workers all across this country. Because yeah, if they can get away with that with the UMWA, what are they going to do at all these other places that don't have strong union protections?
Yeah, that's why I think like power is power of capitalists, of the boss, is more interesting than this greed as an
Mm-hmm.
explainer of these things. And it reminds me like you got to think of like we have to think of this as an attack on all of us, because the capitalists definitely do too.
Mhm.
Like part of that, they're performing not just for themselves and their own. They know when they go to their clubs and their fancy shit that they have other bosses that they're in business with, and they're like, hey, don't fucking let that. You can't be letting these wages rise like that. You can't be doing that. There's exact same pressures on Howard Schultz. Like he's performing for bosses across America, and they are conscious of that stuff. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, that was a good point by bringing there.
Well, I mean, we're gonna zoom out in just a second, but um, I want to like really hit this point home that what we want to do is difficult, right? It's one of those things that's simple to say, right? Working people should unite together and fight against the bosses, but it's hard. It's really hard. Not just in, from a level of like capacity. If you want to do a strike, people, I mean, like, I love folks who want to see this thing change. I'm not coming at them, but this just shows sometimes to me the lack of like thought as to like what is necessary to achieve what we want to do. I remember when Biden first gets elected, there was all these people clamoring for a general strike, right? And like, yeah, like in the sense of like, what do we need to be able to do to change this country? We have to organize the working class and we have to withhold our labor to win the concessions that are necessary. But do you know what a general strike entails? That entails coordination, right? So being able to talk to everybody and coordinate action. And if you're trying to do something where you're waiting them out, that means supporting each other in a period of time where things are going to get really lean and really difficult. And if the left in this country is unable to like seriously stand for these workers and these miners in one of the most prolonged strikes in Alabama's labor history, I don't know how you could ever be talking about something like a general strike, right? I don't mean that to say these things are impossible. I'm saying these things are like, this is an example of a lack of capacity that I think
Yeah.
people need to recognize and think about more than the conversations that everybody has. This is just like about will and about heart and about character. And it's like, certainly for some folks we're about to talk about in a second, that's what's deficient. But we have to be able to build, movements that are really capable of following through on the will and the passion and the commitment that we all have personally to these things, right? Because like I can feel as strongly as possible as I do about what happened to these workers in Alabama, right? But what am I able to do? I'm able to talk about it a little bit on the show, trying to highlight these things. It's insufficient, right? We need stronger mobilizations. We need stronger organizations to be able to put these kind of things in place.